Welcome to our lecture series, Levant, Cradle of Abrahamic Religions, conducting at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Levant Culture and Civilization, focused on confessional and religious culture in Mediterranean area and Middle East, viewed through the lenses of academic experts. We are very pleased to welcome in our today's lecture a competent specialist in Levantine Cinema, Professor Deborah Starr. Deborah Starr is a professor of Near Eastern Studies and director of the Jewish Studies program at Cornell University. She writes and teaches about the issues of identity and intercommunal exchange in Middle Eastern literature and film, with a focus on the Jews of Egypt. She is the author of Remembering Cosmopolitan Egypt, Literature, Culture, and Empire, Routledge 2009, and co-editor with Sasson Samek of Mongrels of Marvels, the Levantine Writings of Jacqueline Shohet Kahanov. Her new book, Togo Mizrahi and the Making of Egyptian Cinema, University of California Press 2020, recuperates the work of a Jewish pioneer of Egyptian cinema. Professor Starr will introduce us today in a very interesting topic, Levantine cinema, ethics, aesthetics, and performance of coexistence in early Egyptian films. Drawing upon examples from her new book, Togo Mizrahi and the Making of Egyptian Cinema, Deborah Starr will illustrate today the way movies employ this Levantine idiom to resist homogenizing notions of national identity. This talk will critically engage with cinematic pluralist nationalism through a Levantine lens. Dear Professor Starr, thank you for accepting our invitation. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful to the Institute for Advanced Studies in Levant Culture and Civilization for hosting me today, and thank you all for coming. This talk is, I've been thinking about the notion, the Levant as a concept for a long time, since since I really started my academic work. And some of this has come to me through the writings of Jacqueline Kahanoff, who was an Egyptian Jewish writer who settled in Israel and wrote there, was published in Hebrew, wrote in English. A very interesting figure who wrote about the Levant or Levantine as a concept. And so that's really influenced my thinking. And as I started working on cinema, the ideas of the Levantine were always there as I was watching Egyptian films, and and came to develop. I've been thinking about this concept of Levantine cinema for, it's actually going on 10 years now. So so I'm happy to share this with you, and I'm really excited to be here in this context with scholars who also think about the Levant, and I really look forward to your questions and feedback. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work. Okay, one moment. Great. Okay, are you seeing my screen?
Sure, yeah.
Yes, thank you. Okay, great. An international crime syndicate that preyed on the unsuspecting residents of Alexandria turned up in Egyptian cinema in the 1930s. Under the cover of a company known as Sharikat Naql al-Amwal, the Corporation for the Transport of Capital, thieves printed counterfeit bills, burgled the bourgeoisie, and bilked families out of their savings. The police repeatedly succeeded in breaking up this crime ring, thanks to the efforts of infiltrators mistaken for members of the organization's inner circle. These exploits were not true crime stories. The Corporation for the Transport of Capital is a fictional entity that featured in 2 comedies directed by Egyptian Jewish filmmaker Togo Mizrahi and produced in his studio in Alexandria. El Manduben, The Two Delegates from 1934, and Ghafir el-Darak, also sometimes rendered as Ghafir el-Darak, The Neighborhood Watchman from 1936. The plots of both films revolve around the misguided efforts of lower class characters to support themselves financially. Through a series of misidentifications, the protagonists are drawn into the criminal exploits of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital. Eventually, the protagonists take advantage of their mistaken identities to assist the police in apprehending the criminals. And are you seeing the slide with the two? You're
Yes.
seeing a full screen slide?
Yes.
Okay, great.
We can see this.
Very good. I won't ask again. These films highlight Alexandria's diversity by pairing protagonists that hail from different religious or ethno-national groups. In The Two Delegates, Shalom, a Jew, and Abdu, a Muslim, seek to earn enough money to get married. In The Neighborhood Watchman, Osman, who is Nubian, and Azuz, who is Lebanese, try to find a steady source of income after Azuz's shop is robbed. In both films, the innocent duo inadvertently stumble into a gangster plot. The Two Delegates and The Neighborhood Watchman provide a framework of law and lawlessness through which members of Alexandria's minorities productively participate in Egyptian society. In both of these films, Levantine masquerades unmask the criminals' plots and lead to the restoration of order and justice. The director and producer of these films, Togo Mizrahi, was the most prolific filmmaker of his day. From 1930 to 1946, he directed and produced 30 Arabic language feature films, most of which he also wrote. In addition to his contributions to Egyptian cinema and Arabic, he also produced 4 Greek language films. Today's talk on Levantine Cinema is derived from my recently published book, Togo Mizrahi and the Making of Egyptian Cinema. And I want to just draw your attention to the fact that this book has been published open access. So it's available for free digital download at the University of California Press website for anyone who's interested. I will begin today's talk with a discussion of Levantine farce. I will lay out how both the genre of farce and Levantine cinema undermine social norms. I will then examine the two films through the lens of Levantine cinema. I will discuss how The Two Delegates and The Neighborhood Watchman define local identity in dialogue with evolving discourses of nationality and nationalism. In both of these films, Levantine characters are depicted as civic-minded and law-abiding subjects who work for the common good. At the same time, these Levantines serve to call into question the social codes and notions of national belonging. The Two Delegates and The Neighborhood Watchman are farces constructed from a series of loosely connected, episodic, character-driven sketches propelled along by misunderstandings and mistaken identities. Modern farces are often constructed around an absurd situation, generally based on extramarital adventures, hence the use of the term bedroom farce. Although farce is a popular form of comedy, critics often disparage the genre. When Togo Mizrahi's farcical films were released, they received mixed reviews in the press. While one critic called Mizrahi's dialogue clever and his jokes innovative, others complained that his comedies engaged in excessive exaggeration and failed to transcend clowning. In subsequent decades, Egyptian film historians have tended to side with farce's detractors. For example, in a survey of Egyptian film genres published in 1996, Ali Abu Shadi offers a scathing appraisal of Togo Mizrahi's comic films. Abu Shadi was a prominent Egyptian film critic who held a number of influential positions, including as the director of the National Film Center and the state censor. In Abu Shadi's assessment, although Mizrahi's films were very popular and successful at the box office, and they made their stars famous, the films featured contrived and exaggerated plot lines and lowbrow humor. He writes, and here I'm quoting from him, and the quote is on the slide, "These films are light comedies. There is no character development, no motivation for action, and no subtlety to the words. They seek only to amuse and entertain, and some are farces using mistaken identity and a misunderstanding as their primary means of arousing laughs." It's pretty harsh. Abu Shadi views farce as inherently conservative, expressing dominant mores and ideology and affirming the status quo and its existing values. Abu Shadi contends that Egyptian comedies of the era, including those by Mizrahi, hewed closely to formulas established by Egyptian comic theater on one hand and by Hollywood on the other. These comedies, he dismissively notes, copied, adapted, Egyptianized, and took whole scenes from Hollywood films. I, of course, take a more favorable view of Togo Mizrahi's films, but I do not dispute some of Abu Shadi's basic contentions. Mizrahi's plots of mistaken identity, like all farce, are indeed contrived and exaggerated. It's what I think makes them funny. Mizrahi's films also reflect the influence of Hollywood, from content, such as gangster plots, to visual style, such as continuity editing. In The Two Delegates and The Neighborhood Watchman, Mizrahi integrates elements of the gangster genre with comedy, romance, and musical performance in a manner that is particularly reminiscent of the Marx Brothers movie Monkey Business from 1931. I take issue, however, with Abu Shadi's foundational assumption that farce is socially conservative. Farce is constructed as an ongoing series of unsettling revelations, in contrast to comedies in which everything is revealed in a climactic scene. This process of unmasking is frequently directed at undermining the tenets of religion, marriage, and moral social codes. In my thinking about farce, I also turned to Michael Bakhtin, who viewed farce as disruptive. For Bakhtin, farce functions as a force for exposing standards and norms. Bakhtin's writings about the novel have been adapted and widely employed in cinema studies. In particular, film studies scholars have drawn upon Bakhtin's notion of the carnivalesque with its practice of masquerade and unmasking. Bakhtin derives his notion of the carnivalesque from practices of medieval carnivals that invert power relations and subvert authority. The topsy-turvy nature of the carnivalesque elevates the grotesque and the lower bodily stratum over social codes of decorum, and we'll see some examples of scatological humor a little later. Representations of the carnivalesque, like farce, can reproduce these subversive tendencies. Film scholar Robert Stam points to a range of ways Bakhtin's carnivalesque is expressed in cinema. Movies often use humor to create anarchy for the purpose of upending institutional hierarchies. Films make us laugh at patriarchal authority, and films can comically privilege the lower bodily stratum. The features of farce that appear culturally conservative to Abu Shadi should instead, according to Robert Stam, be read against the grain. As Stam notes, in a political culture and a commercial film industry where radical alternatives have more or less been ruled out of bounds, it is not surprising that subversion often takes the apolitical form of comic aggressions that violate respectable decorum and decent standards of bodily behavior, end quote. According to Stam, cinematic transgressions of good manners, like the humor in Marx Brothers movies, for example, or in Togo Mizrahi's movies, I claim, should be analyzed as acts of subversion. Mizrahi's films deploy the subversive potential of farce to reflect, lampoon, and critique Egyptian culture and society. I argue that the social codes subverted in Mizrahi's comedies include parochial notions of national identity. The 1930s saw the rise of what some scholars have called the supranationalism in Egypt. These are movements that defined Egyptianness in terms of a broader Arab or Islamic identity. These ascendant nationalist strains increasingly excluded resident non-Muslim minorities like Toko Mizrahi himself. Further, in the interwar period, other exclusionary nationalist discourses such as Greek irredentism, Italian fascism, and Zionism also circulated among some members of Egypt's resident minority communities, dividing them from one another and from the majority culture. Now, by contrast, through the 1930s and 40s, Egyptian cinema, including Togo Mizrahi's films, projected a religiously, ethnically diverse national imaginary. In other words, Egyptian cinema of this era offers an implicit, if not explicit, rejection of these supranationalist ideologies. Cinema instead embraced what I call a Levantine cinematic idiom. The term Levantine refers to a cultural admixture and to individuals whose identities transcend sharply drawn ethno-national boundaries and collective identities. The terms Levant and Levantine are intentionally and necessarily vague. As a geographical term, the boundaries of the Levant are indeterminate. One could say unruly. The term Levantine, here I'm making a distinction between Levant and Levantine, the term Levantine originally referred to residents of the Eastern Mediterranean who are of European origins. Indistinct from the outset, the term Levantine evokes the vagueness of its application and the fluidity and inherent indefinability of the people whom it identifies. By applying the term Levantine to cinema, I aim to highlight the transnational nature of filmmaking. While film industries developed along national lines, film is inherently a collaborative medium. It is also a traveling and transnational medium. Togo Mizrahi's films, for example, screened all around the Arabic-speaking world from the whole range of Arabic-speaking countries, and also many of them were screened in Europe and the Americas as well. The term Levantine acknowledges the ways many individuals associated with the film industries, like Togo Mizrahi, challenge restrictive constructions of national identity. And I don't think I state this anywhere in this talk, but Mizrahi was an Egyptian Jew, was born to a family with multiple generations in Egypt, but he held Italian citizenship. So he was in this category of essentially foreign minority, a sort of foreign nationality within Egypt, although he makes these Egyptian films in Arabic. I employ the term Levantine to analyze 1930s and 1940s Egyptian cinema as a locally situated project reflecting a pluralist ideal. I am not suggesting that the term Levantine or its equivalents in Arabic, French, or Italian would have had currency in 1930s Egyptian film criticism, either among Egyptians or the resident minorities and foreigners. Rather, I have adopted Levantine precisely because of its vagueness and because it evokes porous boundaries of identity. Levantine films share several characteristics. First, these films' representations of Egyptian pluralism reflect and engage with an ethics of coexistence. To be clear, while Levantine farces represent Egyptian diversity, they do not necessarily feature a plot that promotes a pluralist agenda. For example, the two delegates quite evidently espouses an ethics of coexistence. By contrast, the neighborhood watchman, the friendship that develops between Nubian and Lebanese characters appears as a sort of incidental detail. Second, Levantine films utilize cinematic tools to construct a pluralist aesthetic. Many scenes in Togo Mizrahi's 1930s comedies were shot on location in Alexandria's streets, cafes, beaches, and parks, sites where people came in contact with one another. And the two delegates, Shalom and Abdu, a Jew and a Muslim, stride out of a cafe together, arm in arm. Another film by Togo Mizrahi, Sa'a Seba, 7 o'clock, opens with a lengthy, all-encompassing traveling shot through the busy streets of central Alexandria. In these scenes, the camera's inclusive gaze underscores the pluralist ethics of the diegesis. Third, Levantine films foreground the performativity of identity. Plots of mistaken identity highlight the fluid and mutable character of identity as performance. They do not merely arouse laughs, as Abu Shadi contends, although of course they do arouse laughs, but it's not their only purpose. My analyses of mistaken identity and masquerade revealed the plot device's subversive potential. The Levantine cinematic idiom is evident in a range of genres in 1930s and 40s Egyptian cinema and in films produced by a number of different studios. And here I brought a few examples of other Levantine comedies. So I see this expressed in Togo Mizrahi's films, but I didn't want to give you the impression that it was only Togo Mizrahi, only this Egyptian Jew who was integrating this kind of comedy into his films and this subversive Levantine idiom. So here I have two examples from Asya Dagher's Lotus films, directed by Ahmed Galal. We see them both acting here in the image on the lower right. So we have Wife by Proxy up in the upper left from 1936 and The Pasha Director's Daughter from 1937. And here we have another Egyptian comedy that I identify as expressing this Levantine idiom. This is a film produced by Studio Misr and directed by Niyazi Mustafa. This is Salama Esfine from 1937, and it stars Naguib al-Rihani, who is a well-known stage comic actor, really one of the premier comic actors in Egypt, and written by his longtime partner and writing with whom he collaborated on stage as well as on screen, Badia Khairi. As already noted, critics like Ali Abu Shadi dismiss 1930s and 40s genre films as decadent and derivative of Hollywood. Nationalist critics of Egyptian film have also favored social realism over comedy, viewing melodrama as the vehicle best suited to a cinema of substance. As a genre, melodrama has the capacity to reveal social ills. It was also the genre of choice for depicting the anti-colonial struggle. As film scholar Joel Gordon has established, Egyptian melodramas produced following the 1952 revolution articulate, enact, and disperse ideologies of the post-colonial Egyptian state. I argue that by contrast, Levantine farces from the 1930s and 40s articulate, enact, and disperse ideologies of pluralist Egyptian nationalism. Now I'll move on to talking about the movies, and I have some clips for you in what follows. Togo Mizrahi's The Two Delegates portrays a culture of coexistence in Alexandria. The film foregrounds cultural practices shared by Jews and Muslims. Shalom, a Jewish peddler of lottery tickets, wishes to marry Esther, and Abdu, a Muslim butcher's assistant, seeks to wed Amina. Both women are products of middle-class families with bourgeois aspirations. When Shalom and Abdu extend proposals of marriage, they are rejected by the bride's mothers on class grounds. Both prospective mothers-in-law identify the suitor's native garb, the galabiya, seen here on the left, as a sign of poverty and backwardness. So Shalom and Abdu undergo a makeover. The two strive to meet the middle-class expectations of their future in-laws. The two dejected friends set out to purchase a suit and tie to replace the scorned galabeah. By changing their appearance, Shalom and Abdu are engaging in a form of masquerade. Nothing about them changes except their clothes. The scene in the tailor shop where they buy the suits, seen here on the right, highlights the disjuncture between their sense of self and their appearance. The sight of Abdu trying on a top hat sends the two friends into a fit of laughter. This is a narrative of becoming an effendi, and the effendi is a term that reflects education, dress, and to a certain extent, class. So this narrative of becoming an effendi was playing out in Egyptian spaces, both domestic and public, as well as on the Egyptian screen. Dressed in a Western suit and a tarbouche, Shalom and Abdu can pass as members of the effendiya. This change in costume also sets the two friends up for the case of mistaken identity that renders the film a Levantine farce. After purchasing the suits, Shalom and Abdu slip into a barbershop for a shave. When they leave the barbershop, they mistakenly don the wrong suit jackets, bearing lapel pins that identify them as members of an international organized crime outfit. A local band of thieves, under the cover of this company, here it comes again, the Corporation for the Transport of Capital, is anticipating the arrival of two delegates from abroad, world-renowned safecrackers. The international representatives have been brought in to review the corporate books and to oversee a covert operation. Shalom and Abdu are mistaken for the visiting delegates and gain access to the organization's secret lair. The Two Delegates is the earliest surviving film directed by Togo Mizrahi. It's from 1934. He had made the transition from silent to sound film in a feature released the previous year. But The Two Delegates retains a heavy reliance on physical comedy of the silent era. And so this also, because the silent camera is more mobile than the sound camera, the heavy sound camera, he's able to take it out into the streets. And so this is where we get some of the location shooting. So the key moments in Shalom and Abdu's transformation and their mistaken identification as the delegates all take place without words. So I have about a 2-minute clip here where we see this moment of mistaken identity. There's a woman who's representing the Corporation for the Transport of Capital, and she goes to a central square to Manshia to meet up with the two delegates and to bring them back to the corporation's headquarters. And of course, Shalom and Abdu are wearing the wrong suit jackets, and so they get mistaken for the delegates. Miscommunication, like the misinterpretation of nonverbal symbols, the pin and the gesture, sets up comic misunderstandings that serve to highlight the particular characteristics of the film's construction of native Egyptianness. The friendship and collaboration between Shalom and Abdu, Jew and Muslim, also contributes to the restoration of order and justice. At the end of the film, Shalom and Abdu return to the headquarters of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital and fight two of the criminals. When the crime boss hears the commotion, he and his lackeys go to investigate, giving an undercover police officer the opportunity to call for backup. The police arrive and the criminals are apprehended. Back at the station, the police chief thanks Shalom and Abdu for helping capture this dangerous band of criminals. He presents them with a cash reward for their efforts. The windfall, coupled with their earlier wardrobe upgrade, makes it possible for Shalom and Abdu to wed Esther and Amina. Despite its episodic digressions, the plot of the two delegates builds toward the dramatic conclusion of the two weddings. After Shalom's and Abdu's proposals are turned down, two mysterious, wealthy-looking suitors extend proposals of marriage to Esther and Amina. These mystery suitors woo the future mothers-in-law with the promise of financial security. The suitors are actually, you probably guessed this coming, are actually members of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital. They con the families into turning over their savings. Only after a visit by a police investigator do the families learn of the deception and the loss of their money. Shalom's and Abdu's rewards, equivalent to the amount the families squandered on the fake suitors, prompts the families to accept their proposals of marriage. Despite their windfall and their new wardrobe, Shalom and Abdu are no more financially secure than they were at the beginning of the film. They have not secured civil service jobs that would ensure their place among the rising middle class, among the Effendia. But the mere appearance of Shalom's and Abdu's class mobility, their performance of identity, meets the family's equally hollow class aspirations. Shalom and Esther and Abdu and Amina wed in the final scene of the film. The wedding scene is shot to visually emphasize the close friendships between the film's Jewish and Muslim characters. The narrative of coexistence is mirrored in the Levantine aesthetic of the wedding montage. The music plays in a continuous, unbroken stream over a montage of wedding images featuring both couples. So I'm going to show you the clip of the wedding. This is the final scene of the film. There's a little bit of dialogue, which I haven't had a chance to subtitle, but you see the mothers-in-law sitting. Shalom and Abdu enter this, clearly middle-class apartment. And one of the mothers-in-law says, "What, did you bring us the money?" And they sort of pause for a moment. And so we have this, then they hand over the money and the women start celebrating. So that's what's going on in the dialogue. And I hope you enjoy.
هذه 500 جنيه وادي 500 جنيه 500 جنيه 500 جنيه
In this scene, Togo Mizrahi depicts only shared forms of celebration. And there's another wedding scene in one of his other films that also features these same characters. That's even more extensive, and both of these share these characteristics. The scene in The Two Delegates reflects wedding celebrations as practiced in Egypt's cities, including both traditional elements and Western attire that reflect the bourgeois class aspiration of the bride's families. The Two Delegates does not, however, depict religious elements of the wedding ceremonies. There's no chuppah and breaking of the glass, no handshake accompanied by the recitation of the Fatiha. The montage rapidly intercuts between the two celebrations in honor of Shalom and Esther and of Abdu and Amina. This technique serves to blur distinctions between the Jewish and Muslim weddings. By representing the celebrations in this way, the nuptials serve to underscore the film's ethics of coexistence, their representation of deeply intertwined communities of Jews and Muslims coexisting as equals. Now moving on to the second film, The Neighborhood Watchman from 1936. In The Neighborhood Watchman, Ali Kassar plays his signature role, Osman Abd al-Basit, a poor Nubian immigrant to the city. Osman is simple, good-hearted, and honest, but luckless. Despite his best efforts, Osman can't hold a job. At the beginning of The Neighborhood Watchman, Osman is employed as a domestic servant for a member of the foreign minority elites. Preparing for a banquet, Osman is charged with transporting a large tray of food to a bakery for baking in its large oven. En route, hungry birds descend upon the tray, making off with some of the food. When Osman returns to the home of his employer, he is berated, beaten, and kicked out. The episodic plot of the film follows this formula. Osman pursues increasingly contrived and humorous employment opportunities, and each failure is met with verbal lashings or physical beatings. Yet, when confronted with an opportunity to earn money through illicit means, Osman refuses. Over the course of the film, Osman is regularly mistaken for someone else. The title of the film is derived from a series of nested masquerades in which Osman is mistakenly hired to serve as a neighborhood watchman. The film then takes a carnivalesque turn as Osman and his sidekicks try their hand at popular forms of entertainment. The film ends with a body double plot as Osman is mistaken for the crime boss of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital. The subversive potential of The Neighborhood Watchman lies in its Bakhtinian, carnivalesque inversions of power and authority. In The Neighborhood Watchman, the police serve as the figures of authority charged with protecting the populace. But over the course of the film, Osman's actions erode this authority. At the beginning of the film, when birds steal food from Osman's tray, he humorously tries to report the theft to the police. But the officer he contacts berates him and tosses him out of the station for making a mockery of justice. Osman's employment as a night watchman, the title role of the film, is the result of a double case of mistaken identity. First, he is given someone else's job, and then he's sent on assignment under another person's name. Osman's masquerade as a guard, Osman's masquerade as a guard causes a breakdown of the public trust when a crime occurs on his watch. Osman and his sidekick Ba'za, shown here in this ad for the film, are stationed in the vicinity of a store owned by Azuz, a Shami or Levantine Arab merchant. The thieves, members of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital, manage to rob Azuz's shop on Osman's watch, and Osman loses his job. To carry out the crime, the thieves create a diversionary tactic. A female member of their organization, dressed in traditional attire, approaches Osman and Ba'za in distress. She eventually manages to convey that her husband had disappeared and implores them to help locate him. while they attend to the distressed woman, the thieves are left free to rob Azuz's store without arousing suspicion. At precisely this juncture, when Osman's masquerade as a watchman is poised to erode the authority of the police, the film takes an explicitly carnivalesque turn. The movie does not depict the thieves at work, nor does it show the efforts of Osman and Ba'aza to assist the woman in distress. Instead, the scene cuts to a second encounter, disrupting the narrative flow between the depiction of the watchmen's ineptitude and their dismissal from their jobs. This carnivalesque scene is inserted without context and without any clear motivation. The clock strikes 2. Then the scene fades to a doorway from which masquerading revelers are slowly and noisily emerging. 2 tall figures in full head masks appear. Meanwhile, Osman and Ba'aza cower on a bench, trying to convince one another that they are not afraid. The consumed revelers spot the anxious guards and decide to give them a fright. Standing partially in shadow, the pranksters remove their masks, and as their heads are obscured by a black cloth, from the perspective of the frightened guards, it looks like the figures have removed their heads. Ba'aza exhorts Osman to be a man. Unconvincingly bragging of his own bravery, Ba'aza is rendered speechless by the approaching headless apparitions. The revelers then silently trade their heads and then rest them on a bench. As the frightened guards grasp onto one another and shuffle away, the camera zooms in on 2 wet spots on the bench and visible urine stains on their backsides. Mizrahi's comedies do not shy away from such lowbrow antics. Scatological humor sold tickets, and it still does. Ali Abu Shadi specifically cites Mizrahi's willingness to include such scenes as evidence that he was a commercial filmmaker who produced entertainment devoid of social value. By contrast, I read this scene as an articulation of the destabilizing potential of the carnivalesque. Mikhail Bakhtin asserts that, quote, the downward movement is inherent in all forms of popular festive merriment. The mighty thrust downward of the carnivalesque draws our attention to the material bodily lower stratum, end quote. The conclusion of the masquerade scene in this movie may cross the boundaries of good taste, but following Bakhtin, we can read this elevation of the vulgar and the debasement of cinema as an embrace of the subversiveness of carnivalesque farce. The prank is also transformed into a self-referential joke when it is revealed that one of the masked revelers is Togo Mizrahi himself. The pranksters briefly remove their masks in the street, and their discussion about spooking the guards takes place with their faces exposed. Thus, Togo Mizrahi's cameo in this scene in particular, his identity revealed by removing a mask, indexes the Levantine idiom of masquerade and the subversive threat posed by Levantine performativity of identity. The prank scene also functions as a narrative hinge. Up until this point, the Egyptian Ba'aza was Osman's sidekick. But following the theft, Osman's fate instead gets tied up with that of the robbed Levantine shop owner, Azuz. After the theft, Azuz and his Egyptian wife, who was a singer, lose their apartment. Osman's wife also kicks him out after he loses his job. Together, the Nubian, former watchman, the Shami, former shop owner, and the Egyptian singer find 2 rooms in a shared hovel. This way, too, the prank scene signals the transgressive intersection of the carnivalesque and the Levantine. The carnivalesque atmosphere persists as Osman and Azuz seek employment. Azuz's wife returns to the stage to help support her family. a magician performing in the same variety show hires Azuz and Osman as his assistants. Osman appears on stage in a clownish pointed hat and an oversized fake mustache. Although Osman tries to play it straight, the audience, this is the audience internal to the scene, the audience laughs and jeers at his antics. Ever the fool, Osman bungles the first trick by unwittingly revealing the magician's secret to the audience. Osman and Azuz are then summarily dismissed. Meanwhile, Baza tries his luck performing in the streets with a dancing monkey. These carnivalesque performances, while not themselves subversive, index the subversive potential of the performance of Levantine identities elsewhere in the film, including in the film's final episode, which involves inverted identities. Eventually, Osman and Azuz are drawn into a con by the same band of thieves who had robbed the shop. A representative of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital offers Osman and Azuz a job. They share the information with their struggling friend Baza. The three men are provided with large banknotes and asked to fan out over the city to make change. The innocent job seekers do not realize that they are helping to circulate counterfeit bills printed by the gangsters. This false currency exchange is then mirrored in the final act of mistaken identity. It turns out that Osman resembles the crime boss. Also, both characters are played by Ali Kassar. When the members of the Corporation for the Transport of Capital see Osman, they take him for their ruthless leader, treating him with respect and deference. Strange women vie for Osman's attention, thinking he is the crime boss. The plot of mistaken identity leads to a series of humorous interactions and mistaken romantic liaisons before it dawns on Osman that people think he is someone else. Reading other people's reactions, Osman comes to realize his resemblance to the boss. He also figures out that the money they were asked to change is counterfeit. He calls the police chief and reports the crime. When the police eventually arrive at the scene, the crime boss assumes Usman's identity to elude capture. Usman's wife, Ibrahim, arrives, but she cannot initially distinguish between the two men. We see that on the left-hand side of the screen. She mistakenly unleashes her wrath on the crime boss instead of her husband. Ibrahim eventually identifies her husband. The crime boss is apprehended. Osman and Ibrahim are reconciled. And thanks to his role in assisting arrest, Osman is reinstated in his former job as a night watchman. The ethical behavior and cunning of the Levantine characters working together thwarts lawlessness. The neighborhood watchman disrupts, in the neighborhood watchman, disruptions presented by the Levantine idiom are unmasked as harmless, mere pranks or apparitions that may seem threatening, but pose no real danger. The film instead vaunts the power of coexistence, of Levantine ethics, to combat crime that threatens the livelihoods of hardworking Alexandrians of all classes and backgrounds. Thank you very much, and I welcome your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Starr, for this wonderful and impressed introduction in the Levantine cinema, and especially in the Egyptian identity of that time. I'm sure that we will have some questions. I will ask myself, and I think this can be a good question in order to start the discussion about the Egyptian Egyptian and Levantine culture of that time, and namely, I had a look on some parts of your book, and I confess that this is a lovely book, this is a wonderful book. And one of the important questions of your book is about this construct, this concept of coexistence in the Egyptian society of that time. We do not see actually religious boundaries between Jewish and Muslim communities. But how about the Coptic community of that time? Because as much as I know, the Copts were also involved in keeping and in developing the issue of identity at that time. What was the feedback of the Jewish community when Togo Mizrahi constructs or reflects on the identity of coexistence? This would be one side of the coin, and the other side, is there no cultural boundary between Jews and Muslims of Egypt? This is the first question. And a second question will be about this double perspective in terms of Coptic identity and its participation to this cinema culture of that time. In which way alludes Togo Mizrahi to the Coptic question, and how was he actually perceived in Coptic communities, if there are some clues or some literary materials in this sense?
Thank you. Those are both wonderful questions. You're absolutely right that the films, I mean, particularly these Shalom and Abdu films, are creating a place for for Jews, or imagining what a native Jewishness might look like, an Egyptian sort of nativeness. And I don't really talk about that in the passage that I shared with you, because I really wanted to focus on this question of the Levantine. But the character of Shalom, who's this lower class character, who's really kind of the salt of the earth character, along with his sidekick Abdu, reflect this idea that, I mean, this figure that Egyptians tend to sort of embrace as like the true exemplar of Egyptianness, and that is there's a term in Arabic, ibn al-balad, child of the land, right? And so this and it refers to class, it refers to dress. These tend to be craftspeople in the cities, and it generally is a term that applies only to Muslims. And the way that I read this film is it's trying to create, that Shalom's character is trying to create and put out there this idea that Jews could also be native citizens, right? They can also be children of Egypt. And so I think there's something going on there. And so that would also explain why it's an integration between a Jew and a Muslim, the majority culture, right? And that Christians aren't part of the narrative. Christians do appear in his films in the figure of Greeks, not Copts. So we have some Greek figures, mostly not named characters. They're waiters, they're bar owners. There is a character, and I mentioned the film 7 O'Clock, which also stars Ali Kassar, the same one who's in the Night Watchman. There's a figure named George who is Greek. And so that's one where we have a named Greek character, and there's a certain amount of exchange between the two friends. But it is interesting that Copts do not feature regularly in Egyptian cinema as characters on screen, certainly not in this era. That said, there's a really important caveat, which is the earliest surviving silent film, one of the few silent films that has survived from Egypt, features a Coptic character. So there definitely were explorations really in the very early silent era But I think there are a number of reasons why, as a community, the Copts are not comfortable being represented on screen. And it is interesting where we have the film industry really starting in Alexandria. These 1930s movies, I think reflect certain kinds of comedy in Egypt, where you have these kinds of ethnic comedy and these variety shows on stage. Someone, like Ali Kassar and Naguib al-Rihani are start out as stage performers in this kind of variety show context. And Greeks are really quite visible in Alexandria. And I don't think it's a full explanation, but it is certainly noteworthy that that early Egyptian cinema, there are certainly visible Christians, but they aren't necessarily Copts.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful response. I quote from your book, the question, what makes a movie Egyptian, is closely bound up with the question, who is Egyptian? And I would like to ask a second question, in the sense, how Egyptian was Togo Mizrahi actually?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I try to interweave biography with the film history and film analysis. It's part of the story I'm trying to tell. And I'm very grateful that Mizrahi's nephew was willing to share personal stories with me and share some of the personal archive. I think it's complicated, like how he identified, right? He's Italian, he's a Jew, he's Alexandrian. He clearly has a real sensitivity for, things that are really, like that, that Egyptians treasured, right? The comedy, Egyptian, there's this long-standing sort of self-representation of Egyptians as funny, and these comedians who were enormously popular on the stage, migrating to screen and working with them to make, to create this Egyptian cinema, to make it popular actors accessible more widely through cinema. I think he's very involved in Egyptian culture. Personally, again, as I said, he never holds Egyptian nationality. He goes back and forth to Europe. He's educated in Europe. He goes back to Italy just about every summer. He comes back with new technology. He meets his wife in Italy. She's Italian, not Egyptian Italian, and she moves back to Egypt with him. But when things become difficult for Jews in Egypt in the 1950s, so basically he's safe in Egypt during World War II. When Italy is under Mussolini, and then after, in the 1950s, when Egypt is becoming less hospitable to Jews, they settle in Italy. And so I guess the question is, right, how Egyptian is he? And I can't really answer that question except from the citizenship side, but as you point out, the thing that I'm pushing against is, there's a lot of pride in Egyptian cinema. It's, it was enormously successful, and the people are trying to figure out where are the boundaries. We have this colonial period. We have all of these foreigners who are involved in the film industry. What makes a movie Egyptian? And I think fundamentally the question should not be about whether the people involved with the movie had Egyptian citizenship or not. I think that it needs to be about the institutions, what kinds of institutions it's connected with, the film. So Mizrahi was very involved in organizations of producers, and he lobbied the government to protect the local film industry. Egyptian filmmakers at the time saw themselves as doing something to create this national film industry so that Egyptians could watch their own culture on screen and not just be consuming Hollywood films or European films. And so this was really important as a part of expression of, self-identity, of national identity. So, so I think these connections to this thinking of themselves as in the place within Egyptian national identity and the institution building that they saw themselves engaged in is far more important than how many people on the set and on the screen are actually Egyptian citizens. Thank
you so much. We have some question in chat. The first one is from Maxim Onofrei. I have a question. Given that that his filmography is roughly evenly divided between pre-war and wartime films, what influence did the escalating global tensions have on Mizrahi's evolving work? What was his stance on colonial British occupation, and what was that reflected in his cinematography?
Thank you. That's a great question. So I should say that there was pretty heavy censorship in Egyptian cinema at the time. And anything that was directly would comment on British occupation or would directly comment on the monarchy was not permitted. So this is some of where I'm going when I read someone like Robert Stam, who's looking for these sort of subversive tendencies in cinema under these very restrictive categories, right? So that there are certain limitations to what he can say. Now, that said, I don't see a lot of pushback against British colonialism. And again, certainly during World War II, Mizrahi actually, I think, spends a summer volunteering as in the police force, right? So he and I have a picture of him, with one of the British colonial officers. I think, obviously he's as an Italian, married to an Italian citizen, he's very concerned about what's going on in Italy, about the war in Europe, and about fighting fascism. And so I think that any opposition that he might have had, or any relationship he might have had to the British, British colonial government, takes a back seat to, and again, I don't know, he might not have had any opposition to the British, this is not as quite as obvious, but certainly we do see evidence of his concerns about what's going on in Italy. There's a film from 1939 called On a Rainy Night. It's the first film he makes with starring Layla Mourad, who's an Egyptian Jewish singer and actress, who becomes really one of the top box office stars of her era. And so this is the first film they make together, and we see a sequence of events near the beginning of the film where a character gets expelled from Italy. And I think, and I read this as a representation about his anxieties about what's going on in Europe, but it also really interestingly holds up Egyptian cosmopolitanism and Egyptian Levantine society in contradistinction to the intolerance in Europe. So there's this really interesting opposition going on in that film. I also see sort of a kind of anti-monarchy tendencies in another film he makes with Layla Mourad called Layla from 1942. And so that one is also an interesting, the ways that I think he sort of subtly critiques the monarchy. But again, it's all very subtle. So it could get past the censors. And that film actually had issues with the censors because that film is an adaptation of Alexandre Dumas' Camille, the film about about a prostitute. And so that one also had issues with the censors for other reasons, but because of her star power and because it was obviously a very famous novel that had been adapted for stage and screen, it got through. But yeah, so we see that, but I don't see any particular anti-British sentiment, in any either his published articles or in his films.
Thank you. It seems that we have a wide range of questions. The second one is coming from Juana Brenda. It was a wonderful and very comprehensive lecture. Thank you, Dr. Starr. I would like to ask you whether contemporary Egyptian cinema still maintains nationalistic features, and in what form?
Great. And Egyptian cinema, I mean, look, we can use these kind of critical tools in a lot of contexts. There has been a really interesting turn in documentary cinema and in television in the last 2 decades, where you see representations of minority communities. There's a kind of nostalgia for the era of the monarchy in a variety of different contexts. And so we do see that, I think, more in television series and in documentary films than on the big screen. Certainly a generation earlier, somebody like Yusuf Shaheen was making films that engaged with these ideas. But as far as Egyptian cinema now, there's been a heavy influence of investment from the Gulf states. And so a lot has changed in how Egyptian commercial cinema is seeing its market and how it's being financed. I think film is perhaps less nationalistic, as this question asks. I think these early years, we really see an effort to try to create this, and that happens as much off screen as on screen. We see an effort to try to create this Egyptian national cinema in order to promote this local culture. Certainly in the middle of the 20th century, we have a lot of sort of ideologically motivated, nationalist films in the following the Egyptian Revolution, and films that have a lot of social critique that align with the regime's agenda. But that starts really breaking down by the 1960s, as it does in a lot of international cinemas.
Okay, the next one is coming from Mihai Marian. First of all, thank you for the captivating presentation, and sorry I can't enter audio video. Secondly, I would like to ask 4 questions. Wow, in addition to maximum face question, if possible. The first one, what was the influence of European and American cinema on Levantine cinema, and what did it consist of?
Okay, all right, we'll take them one at a time. Excellent. So, so Hollywood cinema was very popular, and we had this in the 1930s. I mean, up through this period. Of course, cinema, sound cinema is being distributed, already quite a few years before Egyptians start making sound films. But it's widely distributed. The cinema houses are often owned by members of these foreign minority elites, and they tend to really prefer screening these, particularly Hollywood films, but certainly French and Italian films as well. And there's a tiered system, so that the first run cinemas are more expensive, and then their second and third tier cinemas, so that the price points are different. The films are a little bit older, and films also kept coming back, especially during the war years when distribution was harder to come by. But the influence is evident, and again, as I was quoting from this film critic, there's you see that early Egyptian cinema is heavily influenced, particularly by Hollywood, although it's not exact. The genres don't necessarily match exactly, but you see a lot of influence. And in this film, I talk about the gangster plot, which is obviously very very visible in both silent and sound film in Hollywood. I see here the influence of the Marx Brothers, particularly in some of Togo Mizrahi's films. I also, in another part of the book, I talk about some of the influence of an actor like Eddie Cantor, who was a sort of Borscht Bell actor who was Jewish and was engaged in certain kinds of vaudeville humor that was very Jewishly inflected, and his films are wildly popular in Egypt. We see cinemas launching their scenes, like one of the premier cinemas launching its season with his movie, right? So cinema was seasonal. It was only in the cooler months. In the summer months, you would have outdoor cinemas that would tend to run second run films, but the new films would come out in the fall and run through the spring. And so, so we see someone like Eddie Cantor. So we see some direct lines of influence and also some broader lines of influence. And so this is some of what later Egyptian critics are uncomfortable with. As you know, in the 1950s, we see things that are more inflected by, say, Italian neorealism.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and the second one somehow linked to the first question. Was Levantine life exposed through Levantine cinema to the public through the eyes and stereotypes of European and Americans about the Levant, or were the motives and games of Western culture transposed into the exotic setting of the Levant? Or was the most faithful mirror of the Levant sought in the film?
I'm trying to understand what the key issues are here.
So
so
in which way?
No, I don't.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't think that I think that things like plot and some cinematic devices are definitely influenced by Hollywood, but they're Egyptianized, right? So that these characters are drawn as perhaps stereotypes, but local stereotypes. Mm-hmm. Perhaps sort of exaggerated characteristics for humor, but again, drawn on local comedy. So I think they're a hybrid in that sense. They're not sort of taking, I'll make a caveat here. So Togo Mizrahi's films are not looking in this sort of very Western way at Egyptian society, at least not as I see it. For example, the film Layla that I just mentioned from 1942, I have this lovely quote. The great Egyptian singer Kulthum went to see the movie, and this is one of these sort of short gossip columns, but leans over to the friend she went to see the movie with and said, "Wow, Togo Mizrahi really managed to Egyptianize this film, and to take this French novel that had been made into a Hollywood film and create an Egyptian movie out of it." Right. So I think there was a real sense that there was that that his films were Egyptian films. None of the critics ever identified them as sort of foreign. Or raise this question: are they Egyptian? Are they not Egyptian? One of his contemporaries, there were these two brothers, the Lama brothers, who, speaking of Levantine characters, were, I believe their family was originally Palestinian or Syrian. They went to South America and then back to Egypt, and they're these really interesting figures. And their films were seen as a little bit more suspect. So they are very Orientalist films. They are picking up their aesthetic from movies like Rudolph Valentino's The Sheikh, right? So that their films, and the press is constantly questioning, like, are these Egyptian films or are these not Egyptian films? Do we, even at the time, and so there were these sort of European or American stereotypes that were appearing on the Egyptian screen. Interestingly, none of those films have survived. I have a lot of images from them from the press. They publish these huge spreads for advertisements. So I have a sense of what they looked like. And I have film reviews, so I know the plots. But it's really interesting that the films that were preserved and have survived to this day were not those Orientalist films. And it may have to do with luck, or it may have had to do with taste. But for whatever reason, those films have not survived.
Thank you. And now a question in terms of the audience. To which audience was Levantine cinema, Levantine or Western audiences specifically addressed? If
Excellent
this
question.
was so.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
If this was so, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, look, I mean, as this is one of the things I point out in the book, is that Tolga Mizrahi was both a director, so in that sense an artist, and a producer, and so in that sense a businessman. So he wanted he wanted to make money. He wanted people to watch his movies, and he worked with this distributor that had distribution again through other Arabic-speaking countries, and so the movies were distributed. I don't have a very clear sense of exactly things like receipts or whatever, but we know that they were screening in in the Levant and Palestine and Syria and in Iraq for sure. Mizrahi writes about his films being screened elsewhere across North Africa. And I know that some of the films were ultimately screened in Europe and the Americas. But it's interesting that while he's in Alexandria, we have many of the press books. So these would be like the programs that people could purchase at the theater. And those are bilingual. They're in French and in Arabic. So clearly at this moment, he's seeing the audience as both these sort of Levantines, the European identified members of like the foreign minorities or whatever, and Arabic-speaking Egyptians. Now, we certainly have examples of Egyptian Muslims and Christians who are educated in French. But nevertheless, I mean, we see the two languages, even though the films are overwhelmingly in Arabic, with very, very little bits of code switching, occasionally Greek. In one of the Shalom and Abdul films, Shalom says Shalom Aleichem, greeting in Hebrew. But the little bits of French. There's a scene in the Two Delegates, a very long scene actually in a massage parlor, which is where the clients are expected to be French, and we French speaking, and we have these really interesting exchanges between characters who appear to be Greeks speaking French, and Shalom and Abdu who don't know French, who can only speak Arabic, and the miscommunications between them. So I think the audience, at least initially, while his studio, up until 1939, while he's producing films in the studio in Alexandria, are very much seeing, are trying to reach both audiences, both the Arabic-speaking and the French-speaking audience, again, even though the dialogue is in Arabic. By 1939, when he moves his studio to Cairo and starts making bigger budget musicals and whatnot, he continues with comedies as well, but we see the press books at that point are only in Arabic. And so again, there's a lot of shifting going on in the film industry and how the film industry is seeing itself. I don't know that fundamentally the audience changes that much, but there is a certain kind of shift that happens in how he sees his films and how they're marketed.
And the last question, which can create a bridge between Levant and Occident, Levant and West. In which way did Levantine Cinema contribute to the occidentalization of the Levant?
Look, I think one of the things I see in this notion of the Levantine is the ways that the cultural interaction affects everything it touches, right? Both the sort of Levantine society, the Italians and French speakers in Alexandria, and the Egyptians who are seeing these films, right? So I think it's having an impact in both directions. I think one of the things that's important to remember is that this, let's call it the Levantine society, is effectively rejected, right? I mean, that there continues to be certain kinds of diversity in Egyptian cities, but it's not this. It doesn't look the same as it did in the interwar period. So the vast majority of the Jews leave in the middle of the 20th century. We have emigration of Greeks and Italians. Anyone with a French or British citizenship is kicked out after the 1956 Suez conflict. And so we have these sort of, again, these radical shifts in how Egyptians see themselves and how, again, cinema represents what Egypt looks like, and what Egyptians value in themselves. And so I think that it joins in very late in the process, the cinema, right? It's, cinema really gets its footing in 1930s. And we have a lot of wrestling with, relationship to the West, certainly in that period, but it also, I think, in literature and in journals, starts a good deal earlier, goes back into the 19th century as Arab intellectuals are thinking about the relationship to the West. And so I think, does it contribute? Perhaps, but I think that it's already riding a wave of influence and reckoning of the relationship between East and West.
Thank you so much for all your commentaries, responses, and this was a wonderful presentation from which we have learned a lot about the Egyptian cinema industry, comprised of the diverse mix of Egyptians, non-citizens, residents, and foreigners. We have seen that Egypt depicted in these films often reflects a flexible, inclusive notion of national belonging. As you rightly identified, there have been 3 or more characteristics of a Levantine cinematic idiom in early Egyptian cinema: ethics, aesthetics, and performance of identity. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you again for accepting our invitation.
It's really, really my pleasure. And thank you all for the wonderful questions and for sticking with me. And I really appreciate your taking the time to be here.
It was a very nice privilege to have you as speaker in our lecture series, and I hope we have other opportunities to work together.
Likewise, thank you. And thank you again for your generous offer to host me. And it's been wonderful.